The world was older than memory. It turned beneath a dim and distant sun, and the color of its soil was the color of dried blood. Winds moved across endless valleys, carrying dust that had fallen from cliffs 1,000 years before. This was Korriban. It was not yet a graveyard. It was a living world breathing in silence, waiting for its story to begin. The Sith did not yet have an empire. They did not have ships or armies. They had only themselves, a people shaped by stone and storm. Their skin bore the deep crimson of the planet that raised them. Their faces carried bone ridges like crowns. They were not monsters. They were not yet a legend. They were simply a species that had learned to endure. Korriban gave nothing freely. The ground was hard and food was scarce. Storms cut through the canyons like knives, stripping the weak from the strong. In that harshness, the Sith found their first truth. To live was to struggle. To be weak was to vanish. Power was not a hunger for conquest. Power was survival. Strength was the only proof that the gods had not abandoned them. They built no cities. They raised temples. The temples were not monuments to themselves. They were doorways. The Sith believed the Force lived inside the stone. They called it by names that are now lost, but they felt it in every breath. It did not divide into light or dark. It was wild, fierce, and constant. It was in their blood and in their dreams. When they bled into the sand, they said the planet was drinking their strength. When they prayed, they whispered to shapes in the air that no outsider would ever see. The Sith clans fought among themselves. No king ruled forever. No tribe stayed whole for long. Bloodlines rose, broke, and vanished like storms across the dunes. Yet one belief bound them. Power was not only a weapon. Power was the law of the universe. To hold it was to exist. To lose it was to disappear. They marked the sand with circles of bone and ash. They burned incense of iron and blood. In deep caves they sang to the shadows. Sometimes something answered, a voice in a dream, a figure at the edge of sight. The Sith did not fear these things. They believed the gods had many faces. Darkness was not a curse. Darkness was a teacher. It was the silence at the heart of the storm. Legends spoke of a valley where the ground was black with ash from a fire that had burned for 13 years. The clans that survived it no longer spoke of mercy. They carved their history into stone pillars so that the Force would remember their names. Even then, before the first invasion, they were beginning to shape themselves into something the galaxy would not understand. There were no Darths. There was no empire. There was only a people on a world of red sand and endless sky. The Force moved like a storm around them, but it had no doctrine yet. It waited, it listened, it learned through them. Korriban was not yet a tomb, but it was already a cradle. In that cradle, the first seeds of a darkness were sleeping. No one in the galaxy saw it. No one felt it. Only the Sith knew, in the marrow of their bones, that their world was not just their home. It was a promise. And promises on Korriban were always written in blood. There was no mercy in their world. The Sith purebloods were born into heat, hunger, and hardness. They learned to walk with stone beneath their feet and wind slicing across their skin. Childhood did not exist in the way other species would later define it. The young were taught to kill or die. The elders taught them that pain was not punishment, it was preparation. Each clan was built on blood. Bloodline determined nothing unless it was proven. Trials were not ceremonial, they were brutal. Initiates were sent into the caverns below the Valley of Gold with nothing but a blade carved from obsidian. They were told to return with the heart of something they had killed. Some never returned. Their names were forgotten. To remember the weak was to insult the strong. Those who survived were marked. Their faces were carved with ritual lines. Not all of them healed. The Sith did not hide scars. They honored them. Scars were sacred. They were the evidence of a lesson learned. Those who bore none were considered untested, hollow, unfinished. Even the priests carried wounds beneath their ceremonial armor. They did not speak of peace. They spoke of endurance. The Force moved differently on Korriban. It did not soothe, it provoked. The Sith did not meditate, they invoked. They called the Force like a storm, with chants and blood rites, forcing it to bend or burn. And sometimes, the Force struck back. There were stories of young acolytes bursting into flame during initiation. The clans did not mourn them. They said the gods had refused their offering. These beliefs shaped more than rituals. They shaped the soul. Compassion was weakness. Mercy was rot. Those who showed it were feared, not admired. It was said that once, long ago, a Sith elder spared a rival's child. That same child returned years later to burn his entire clan alive. No Sith ever told that story as a tragedy. It was taught as a warning. Even their gods were cruel. The spirits the Sith called upon did not grant peace or answers. They offered only strength through suffering. In the sacred cave of Ajunta, visions came with pain. Pilgrims carved their own arms open with bone daggers to earn what they called the second sight. Most saw nothing. A few saw their deaths. Some saw worse memories that were not theirs. Wars that had not happened yet. Faces of people they would kill but had never met. These were considered blessings. And in the midst of all this there was pride. A cold, unshakable pride that came from surviving what others could not imagine. The Sith did not weep, not because they lacked grief, but because even grief was a gift the weak had not earned. Love was rare, family was fragile, but loyalty was iron. When two Sith formed a bond, it was not soft, it was forged, and when that bond was broken, the vengeance was absolute. There were no outsiders on Korriban, no Republic, no Jedi, not yet, but the Sith had already shaped themselves into something the galaxy would fear once it learned their name. They had made pain a teacher. They had made suffering a shrine. Their world had taught them that life was war, and war was eternal. The galaxy would call them evil, but the Sith had another word for what they were becoming. They called it worthy. They arrived as strangers, wrapped in light. The Jedi had not come to conquer. Not at first. Their ships fell through Korriban's skies like falling stars, graceful and clean against the ash-colored clouds. Their robes were soft, their voices calm. They spoke of balance, of peace, of a force that unified all life. But their eyes saw only what they wanted to see. They did not understand where they had landed. The Sith watched from the cliffs. To them, these visitors looked delicate. They spoke of control, of harmony. But the force the Sith knew was not gentle. It was a storm. It was fire beneath the skin. It punished hesitation and rewarded rage. The Jedi's way was foreign, untrue, even dangerous. They spoke of fear as a path to darkness. But the Sith had been born in fear, molded by it, strengthened through it. The first meetings were not battles, they were conversations, quiet, tense, and heavy with misunderstanding. Some Jedi believed the Sith could be taught. They saw potential for redemption. They misunderstood what the Sith were, not fallen, not broken, just different, a difference born not from corruption, but from survival. There were moments when dialogue flickered like a fragile flame, but it could not hold against the wind. Among the Jedi were some who felt the pull of Korriban too deeply. They stood at the edge of the ancient temples and felt something inside them move. The red sands whispered to them. The stone held memories, power clung to the air, and power, when it is close enough to taste, is hard to forget. One by one, a few broke away. They did not fall all at once. There were no screams, no betrayals shouted across battlefields, only quiet footsteps in the wrong direction. Only questions asked too often. Why should pain be feared if it makes one stronger? Why must love be forbidden if it gives one purpose? Why must we reject power if we were born to wield it? These were not Sith yet, but they were no longer Jedi. They remained behind when their ships departed. They stayed in the temples. They studied the writings carved in stone. learned the rituals, and bled into the sand as the Sith did. The pure-blood clans watched them closely. Some were killed, others were spared, a few were welcomed, and from these survivors something began to change. The Sith learned new things, how to shape the Force with more precision, how to build weapons of thought and will. And the fallen Jedi learned how to let go of their chains. They found a freedom in the pain, a clarity in the chaos. They began to believe that the Jedi Code was not peace, it was fear, fear of what the Force could truly do. The union was slow and unnatural, but it was inevitable. Over years, then decades, these exiles and the native Sith fused their beliefs into something new. Their children were different, stronger, wilder, and the temples, once silent, now roared with energy. The Force did not flow, it surged. There were no more quiet meetings, no more ships offering peace. The Jedi, sensing what had begun, did not return, not yet, but when they did, it would not be to teach. It would be to destroy. And Korriban would remember. They did not call it darkness. Not at first. The Sith believed they were awakening something that had always been sleeping. The Force was not being twisted, it was being freed. The rituals became deeper. The temples expanded. New chambers were carved where none had been before. In those places, the Force pulsed like a heartbeat, heavy, hot, and alive. They no longer worshipped the unknown, they commanded it. And something began to answer. The exiles, once Jedi, now unbound, began teaching their own doctrines. Doctrine born not from harmony but from power. Emotion became sacred, anger was not denied, it was embraced, suffering was not hidden. It was transformed, pain was the gate through which one passed to become more than flesh. They called it strength. But strength came at a cost. The pure-blood clans, once scattered and bound by tribal code, began to unify under new masters. These masters were not elders. They were warriors, sorcerers, and former Jedi who now named themselves Lords. Their eyes burned with unnatural fire. Their voices could shatter stone, and around them the Force thickened like smoke. It began to rot the air. This was no longer the natural power of the planet. It had changed. It had been fed. The rituals demanded more. Blood alone was no longer enough. Sacrifice was required. Willingly given or taken by force, it made no difference to the dark. And still, the Sith did not see evil. They saw evolution. The most powerful among them began experimenting. Alchemy, binding, shaping life and death with the Force. Some succeeded. Others screamed themselves into nothingness. One Lord, remembered only in whispers, tore open his own body to replace his heart with a crystal forged from volcanic glass. He lived for 200 years, but by the end he no longer remembered his name. The temples filled with secrets. The caves echoed with chants in forgotten tongues. And far above, the stars began to shift. The Jedi did not speak of these events, not publicly, but in private. Among their high council, concern had turned to dread. The fallen had not vanished. They had multiplied. They had changed something ancient, something sacred, and the light could feel it, like a wound in the Force that would not heal. A decision was made. Quiet, unofficial, but final. If the Sith could not be brought back to the path, they would be removed from it. That war had not yet begun, but the darkness had already taken root. It had made a home in the red sands, in the temples, in the minds of the broken, and in the hearts of those who believed that power was the only truth. What the Sith had once worshipped, they now became. They no longer bled for the Force bled for them. And though no battle had yet scarred the sky, the galaxy had already lost something precious. A balance was shifting. A shadow was growing. The Force was no longer waiting. It was choosing sides. And the Sith, no longer a people but a purpose, had chosen theirs. They would not be forgotten. They would make certain of it. Chapter 2. The Exiles and the Birth of Hate. The war should have ended them. The 100-year darkness began with questions, quiet ones, whispers in the corners of the Jedi Temple, debates about life, about death, and about the limits of the Force. Some believed the Jedi had grown blind, afraid to use what the Force truly offered. They studied forbidden arts, not to destroy, but to understand. But the Order saw corruption, it saw danger, and it responded with exile. Those exiles did not kneel, they went to war. 100 years of blood, across forgotten systems and ruined worlds. The Jedi fought with conviction. The exiles fought with fire. They had abandoned the Jedi code. They embraced raw power. They learned to shape flesh, to twist life itself, to create armies from darkness. It was not hate that drove them at first. It was belief, a belief that the Force was not meant to be chained. But war changes everything. Their names were erased from the archives, their faces were stripped from history, but their legacy lived in scars across the stars. Jedi fell in numbers not seen for centuries. Planets were scarred, civilizations were burned to silence, and slowly, what began as rebellion became obsession. The exiles no longer fought for understanding, they fought to destroy. And they were losing. One by one, they were hunted. Their allies turned, their weapons failed. The Republic joined the purge. The Jedi were relentless. They did not seek capture, they sought extinction. And in the final days, the last of the exiles were cornered, broken and bound. The Jedi held judgment without mercy. They were to be executed, but execution was denied. A compromise was offered, a ship, one chance. The last surviving dark Jedi, few in number, wounded in body and spirit, were cast into the unknown regions. They were to vanish, to disappear beyond the reach of Republic space. The Jedi believed it was a merciful end. They did not know what they had done. The ship drifted through wild space, systems uncharted, stars unnamed. Days passed into weeks. The wounded exiles sat in silence. Some meditated, some wept, some stared into the darkness, searching for anything that resembled purpose. They were not lords, they were not warriors, they were ashes floating through the void. Until they found Korriban. The planet called to them. It was not through words, not through signals, but through feeling. The moment they passed into the system, they felt it raw, ancient and waiting, a wound in the Force that had never healed. They followed the pulse, the ship descended into the red dust, and the story of the Sith began again. What the exiles found was not a wasteland, it was a people, crimson-skinned, proud and strong. The Sith purebloods watched the ship fall from the sky like fire. They approached it without fear. They saw not enemies but omens, and when the exiles stepped onto the sand, the clans knelt. The Sith believed their gods had returned, and the exiles believed they had found salvation. But salvation was only the illusion at the edge of power. What truly began that day was something neither side understood, a convergence, a fusion, the birth of a new kind of darkness, one shaped not only by pain, but by betrayal, not only by belief, but by loss. They had survived the war, but they had not survived themselves. The red sky shimmered with heat. When the ship tore through the upper atmosphere, it was already burning. Its hull had been scarred by years of war, its engines coughing black smoke into the clouds. The exiles did not speak as they descended. There was nothing left to say. They had been warriors, heretics, commanders of armies now turned to dust. All that remained was breath, memory, and the slow fall toward an unknown world. The planet did not resist their arrival. Korriban welcomed them with silence. The ship groaned as it landed in the valley, half buried in sand. Outside, the landscape stretched endlessly, jagged cliffs, blood-colored stone, and a wind that howled without rest. The air was dry and old. It tasted of ash and secrets. And they were being watched. The Sith purebloods came without fear. They emerged from the cliffs in silence, hundreds of them. Their skin bore the markings of old rituals. Their eyes held the wild, unyielding look of those who had never bowed to anything but survival. They did not speak galactic basic. They did not lower their weapons, but neither did they attack. The exiles stepped forward. One among them, taller, armored, bearing a scar that split his face, extended his hand. Not in peace, not in challenge, but as a gesture of power. His fingers curled slightly, and the Force answered. The wind swirled, the sand shifted, the valley trembled, and the Sith fell to their knees. To the purebloods, it was not submission, it was recognition. They believed their gods had returned, not as spirits, but as flesh. For centuries their mystics had spoken of fire from the sky, and strangers crowned in shadow. The exiles, tired and broken, did not argue. They accepted the crown. In the weeks that followed, the two peoples began to merge, slowly, uneasily. The Sith did not trust easily, and the exiles carried their own wounds, betrayals at the hands of their brothers, the guilt of what they had become, and the hunger for something they could no longer name. But they understood each other in one way. Both had been shaped by pain. The exiles began teaching, not gently. Their way of the Force was colder, sharper. They showed the Sith how to reach beyond instinct, how to control, how to dominate. They taught them language, discipline, and the art of war. In return, the Sith gave them temples, blood rites, and something more valuable than knowledge. They gave them belief. For the first time since their exile, the fallen Jedi were no longer fugitives. They were gods, prophets, kings. The Force pulsed stronger here. It moved through the stones, it echoed in the temples. Some of the exiles wept in silence at night, alone, knowing that what they had lost among the stars had returned to them in this place, not as redemption, but as power. They began to build, not homes, thrones, not cities, tombs. The lines between the two cultures blurred. Children were born who carried both bloods, red-skinned, Force-sensitive, and burning with potential. And in time those children would surpass both their ancestors and their teachers. But on that first day, there was only the sand, the stars, and the sound of breath returning to lungs that had almost given up. The Jedi had cast them away, but the Force had not. It had led them here, to this cursed world, not to die, but to begin again. And the galaxy would never be the same. They did not call themselves Sith Lords, not yet. At first they were simply masters, teachers, guides. The purebloods listened because the Force obeyed them, but in time, obedience became reverence. Reverence became worship, and worship, when left to grow in silence and fear, becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes empire. The strongest of the exiles took new names, names not given, but claimed. One wrapped himself in black armor and called himself king. Another, a woman whose voice could quiet beasts, crowned herself with fire and spoke only through visions. They were not united. They did not seek consensus. Each exile shaped their dominion through strength alone. Those who lacked it vanished. The Sith clans adapted. Their tribal codes shifted beneath new hierarchies. Temples were rededicated, not to nameless gods, but to living rulers. Banners of bone and red silk flew in the wind. The great cities of Korriban rose not as homes, but as monuments. Zeus, Dromund Kaas, and Relg followed, cold worlds that welcomed the shadow with open hands. In their halls, Sith Lords whispered truths the Jedi would not speak. That peace was a lie, that only passion led to strength, that the Force did not care for balance, only will. These were not yet the Sith teachings recorded in holocrons. They were the first thoughts, raw, unrefined, and beautiful in their cruelty. The purebloods gave their loyalty willingly. But loyalty was not love. Love had no place in the new Sith Order. There was only power and fear. The exiles did not rule with compassion. They ruled with spectacle, public executions, ritual duels, armies bred not for protection but for conquest. They called it justice, but the truth was simpler. They were building a weapon called legacy. And to forge it, they needed something the Jedi had never understood. They needed hate. Hate was not taught through doctrine. It was born through pain. The exiles remembered everything, every betrayal, every trial, every Jedi who had turned away from them in the hour of need. That memory festered. It was passed down in words, in rituals, in dreams. Young Sith were taught not only to obey, but to remember the crimes of the Republic, to remember the silence of the Jedi, to remember exile not as punishment but as prophecy. They were not meant to serve. They were meant to return. And through their return, they would show the galaxy what had been cast away. The Force shifted around them, heavier, colder. The ancient temples began to bleed darkness into the land itself. Crops failed. Storms grew longer. The people of Korriban called it ascension. The Jedi, far beyond the stars, felt only unease. Whispers came through the Force like smoke, faint, bitter, and filled with mourning. But the Jedi did not act. Not yet. The Sith saw this as confirmation that their enemies feared them, that their return was inevitable. Their empire had not yet expanded beyond their own borders, but the structure had been built, a hierarchy of lords, apprentices, and the enslaved, a code still forming, a crown still dripping in blood. The Jedi had exiled a few broken warriors, but what they had created was something far worse. The silence was broken by fire. When the Jedi finally returned to Korriban, they did not come to negotiate. They came with fleets, with blades, with fear. They had felt the change in the Force too late, like a sickness that had spread while they slept. The Sith were no longer a hidden cult. They were an empire forged in pain and fueled by belief. The Jedi expected decay. What they found was order. Not peace, not stability, but power. Terrifying in its clarity, the Sith had taken every wound the Order had left them and sharpened it into law. Their people obeyed because they believed. Their armies fought not for duty but for destiny, and their lords, once exiles, had become gods of war. The Jedi saw corruption. The Sith saw justice. The first battle was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Jedi landed in the Valley of the Dark Lords, where statues now stood of those they had cast out centuries before. They demanded surrender. The Sith answered with lightning. Whole squadrons fell before their feet touched the ground. The sand turned black. The sky wept red. But the Jedi did not stop. They sent more. Dozens of systems ignited, from the outer rim to the edges of wild space. War spread like rot through a forest. The great hyperspace war had begun. It would last only a few years, but its scars would never fade. Jedi temples would burn, Sith tombs would be sealed. Entire worlds would be consumed in vengeance, and still, neither side would understand what had truly happened. Because this was never just a war. It was a reckoning. The Jedi had exiled their brothers and believed the story had ended. But Korriban had turned that exile into scripture. The Sith did not forget. They trained their young in memory. In rage, in grief, they turned betrayal into prophecy. And when the Jedi returned, it was not to stop a threat. It was to meet the consequences of their own failure. The Sith fell, eventually. The Republic overwhelmed them with numbers, with fire, with fear. One by one, their strongholds were torn down. Their leaders were killed or vanished. Korriban was abandoned, then buried. The Jedi called it a victory. But it was not. The Sith Empire did not die. It scattered. It adapted. It remembered. Even as ruins cooled and names were lost to time, the bloodline of pain endured. In secret, in silence, in shadows. The Jedi left thinking they had ended something. But all they had done was teach the Sith a final lesson. That hate survives. It survives defeat. It survives silence. It survives death. And it waits. In tombs, in whispers, in the blood of apprentices yet unborn, the Sith would rise again, not because they were strong, but because the Jedi had forgotten the cost of casting aside their own. The first Sith Empire had not been built by conquest. It had been built by trauma, and the galaxy would keep paying for it again and again with every flame that rose from the ashes of that first exile. Chapter 3: Naga Sadow and the Empire that burned. He was not born into darkness. He shaped it. Long after the Jedi vanished from Korriban's skies and the galaxy forgot the fires of exile, the Sith Empire lived in silence. It spread from Korriban to Zeost, growing in shadow. The Jedi did not see. The Republic did not know. But beneath the ice and stone of Zeost's dark halls, a figure rose, not by blade, not by war, but by design. His name was Naga Sadow. And he did not believe in limits. He was a student of sorcery, a master of Sith alchemy. Where others studied to protect, he experimented to control. In the great libraries of Zeost, he found ancient teachings carved in forgotten dialects, scripts that spoke of binding, of fusion, of bending the Force until it obeyed not nature, but desire. He did not fear what the Force could do. He feared what it had not done yet. The Sith Empire at that time was not united. It was ruled by a council, lords locked in cold war, each waiting for the other to make a fatal move. They had grown cautious, careful, silent. But Sadow saw silence as a prison. He believed the Sith were not meant to survive in hiding. They were meant to dominate. And the galaxy had been left unclaimed for too long. He waited for a reason, and then it arrived. Two humans, explorers from the Republic, stumbled into Sith space, captured, interrogated. They spoke of a Republic still strong but unprepared, peaceful, blind. The Sith Council debated. Most wanted to hide, execute the intruders, bury the evidence. Sadow disagreed. He saw opportunity. He spoke of conquest, of destiny. He said the Force itself had brought the strangers to them. But the council did not listen, so Sadow did what many Sith would do after him. He made them listen. In the dead of night, he assassinated the reigning Dark Lord. Then he framed his political rival, Ludo Kresh. The council fractured. Civil war began. And Sadow emerged from the chaos wearing a new title, Dark Lord of the Sith. But a title was not enough. He needed belief. Not just from the council, but from the masses. So he released the Republic explorers, sent them back across space, with implanted visions, false memories of Sith cruelty and vast power. The Republic would panic. It would prepare for war. And that was exactly what Sadow wanted. While others braced for invasion, he built one. He summoned warriors from every Sith world. He forged weapons laced with alchemy, blades that screamed, beasts that bled lava, ships powered by meditation spheres and ancient magic. He knew this would not be a war of numbers. It would be a war of fear, a war of fire and illusion. He did not want to destroy the Republic. He wanted it to surrender before the first shot was fired. In hidden chambers beneath Zeost, his sorcery deepened. He split his consciousness across doubles. He conjured armies of illusion. He bled crystals with his own life force to power ships that should not fly. The Force groaned under his weight, and still he pushed further. He did not believe in balance. He believed in victory. And with the Republic unknowingly walking into his trap, Naga Sadow stood at the edge of history. Not as a leader, but as a fuse waiting to be lit. The first strike did not come from the Republic. It came from Naga Sadow. His war began not with fleets moving openly through hyperspace, but with shadows sent ahead of them. Spies, sorcery, Illusions planted in the minds of Republic leaders, worlds far from the core began to whisper of threats they could not see. Fleets were assembled to defend nothing. Senators argued about enemies that were not there. Panic spread like a sickness, and when fear reached its height, the real invasion began. It was a war crafted like a ritual. Sadow's fleet burst from hyperspace above unprepared worlds. His ships were not like the Republic's, they were living things forged from alchemy and steel. Meditation spheres guided their paths, allowing Sadow's sorcery to bend time and distance. Where the Republic expected battle, it found nightmare. Asteroids hurled through hyperspace, burning with dark energy. Beast ships vomiting soldiers onto cities, whole battalions appearing as mirages until they struck. Republic defenses shattered. But victory was not simple. Within the Sith Empire, not all had supported Sadow's war. Ludo Kresh still lived. He had gathered his own followers, branding Sadow a traitor who had doomed them all. As Sadow's fleet spread into Republic space, Kresh struck at home. Civil war burned even as conquest began. Sith fought Sith in hidden corridors, in deep space, in the halls of the temples. Apprentices murdered masters. Armies tore each other apart while the Republic bled. Sadow ignored it. He believed war itself would decide who was worthy. Each battle pushed him further into the dark arts. He no longer fought with strategy alone. He fed his own life into his sorcery, amplifying his fleets, guiding entire armies through visions. On Coruscant, riots broke out. Entire sectors burned. The Republic called upon every Jedi, but even they could not be everywhere at once. The war had become a wave, and the wave carried Sadow's name. Yet cracks were forming. His illusions demanded more energy. His fleet stretched thin. For every world conquered, two slipped away. For every Jedi killed, another rose. The Republic learned his tactics, adapted to his deceptions, and behind him, on Zaost, Kresh gathered strength. The Sith Empire was becoming what the Jedi had once been, divided, suspicious, and afraid. Still, Sadow pressed on. The war reached its zenith at Karek. Republic forces massed for a counterstrike. Sadow, unwilling to retreat, unleashed a weapon unseen before or since. Using the Force, he caused the star itself to flare, a solar eruption that consumed fleets on both sides. Thousands died. Whole ships vaporized, and Sadow stood at the center of it, feeling the power of a sun tearing itself apart through his mind. He had not won. He had only burned. The Republic staggered but did not fall. The Jedi, though wounded, began to drive the Sith back, and Sadow's enemies inside his own empire scented weakness. Kresh launched a final assault, hoping to kill Sadow and claim the title of Dark Lord for himself. Brother turned against brother, master against apprentice. The war that had begun as destiny was collapsing into chaos. It was not conquest. It was self-destruction. Yet even as his empire cracked, Sadow refused to yield. He still believed the Sith could win. He still believed he could shape the galaxy into the image he carried in his mind. But belief without balance is only fire, and fire cannot hold. The great hyperspace war, ignited by one man's vision, was devouring him from within. The stars no longer obeyed him. Nega Sadow had burned too brightly, too quickly. What he had summoned into the galaxy was not an empire. It was a storm, one without shape, one without end. And now it turned back upon him. Ludo Kresh attacked with fury sharpened by betrayal. His forces struck not the Republic, but Sadow's strongholds. He called the Dark Lord a liar, a heretic, a destroyer of the old ways. But even in war, the Sith could not unite. Kresh's fleet was strong, but not strong enough. Sadow lured him into a trap. Their ships met in orbit above Primus Golud, a star still trembling from Sadow's earlier rituals. The battle was brief. Kresh was killed, his ship torn apart in a blinding eruption. Sadow had won, but the victory was ash in his mouth. The Republic had regrouped. The Jedi had returned to the front in full strength. The war no longer favored illusion. It demanded strength, discipline, unity. The Sith had none of these. Their forces were scattered across too many systems. Their resources dwindled. Their sorcery frayed. What began as dominance had become desperation. One by one, Shadow Sith's conquests fell. Worlds he had taken in days were retaken in hours. The Republic struck back not with rage, but with method, precision, patience. Shadow's armies could not match their resolve. His weapons, so fearsome at first, became predictable. His beasts died in cages. His spells lost power. And the Sith began to abandon him. Some fled into the stars. Some turned against him. Others simply vanished, their loyalty broken not by fear, but by disappointment. The dream he had offered them had collapsed, not with a single defeat, but with a slow, unrelenting silence. Shadow knew he had lost, but he would not give the Jedi his death. He retreated to Yavin 4, a jungle moon far from the heart of the galaxy. There he built temples in the ancient Massassi style, huge stone pyramids powered by ritual and memory. He enslaved the local warriors and twisted them with alchemy, reshaping their bodies and minds until they were no longer men but monsters. And then he disappeared. Some say he placed himself in suspended animation, waiting for a time when the Sith could rise again. Others say he fell into madness, consumed by the voices he once commanded. No one truly knows, because after the fires of his war died, the galaxy buried his name. The Jedi called it a victory. The Republic called it a restoration. But what they did not see, what they could not understand, was that the Sith had learned, not about the Force, about failure. Shadow had proven that the Sith could terrify the galaxy, but not control it. That passion without patience was a weapon turned inward. That empires built on ambition alone would always burn. He was the last of his kind, the last of the old Sith Empire. And in his fall, he left behind something more dangerous than armies or temples. He left behind a lesson, one that would echo through the shadows for 1,000 years. That raw power was not enough. That to rule, one must endure. That to survive, the Sith must change. The war ended without celebration. The Republic did not cheer. The Jedi did not sing. They returned from the battlefields in silence, burdened by what they had seen. Whole planets had vanished beneath Sith fire, cities reduced to stone and shadow, families broken, stars scarred. The maps of the galaxy had changed, but few knew how much had been lost. They called it peace, but it was not. It was quiet, and in that quiet something waited. The Sith Empire, once a proud and burning thing, was gone. The throne of Zeus stood empty, the great temples of Corridon were sealed, the bodies of the lords were buried beneath stone. But darkness is not buried so easily. Beneath the surface, rituals still whispered. In the deepest chambers, energy still pulsed, and in the memory of the Force, the scream of a broken war still echoed. The Jedi believed they had saved the galaxy, but they had only delayed its fall. Mega Shadow's war had not just scorched stars, it had carved new paths through hyperspace, through the mind, through fear. The Republic grew stronger, yes, but more guarded. It placed fortresses where temples had once stood. It built fleets not for exploration, but for defense. And in the Order itself, a question remained: how could this have happened? They never answered it. They moved on. But the Sith did not. Across forgotten moons and unnamed worlds, survivors gathered, not many, scattered, wounded, silent, but they remembered. Some became warlords, others became ghosts. A few slipped into the unknown regions, carrying fragments of Shadow's teachings, fragments of the code, fragments of hate. They did not seek revenge. Not yet. They waited. And over generations, they watched the Republic grow blind again. They watched the Jedi speak of peace without remembering the cost of forgetting. And slowly, without war, without armies, without fire, Sadow's dream began to return, not as an empire of noise, but as a whisper that would become a shadow. And one day, the shadow would take form again. The Jedi did not understand, because they had never truly faced what the Sith had become. To them, the war was over. The villain was dead. The lesson was learned. But Sadow had not been a villain. He had been a mirror. He showed them what they had tried to deny, that the Force did not belong to the Jedi, that belief alone could shape the fate of the galaxy, that passion could be as powerful as peace, that control was an illusion, and one day illusions always break. His empire had burned, but in the ashes something remained, something quieter, something stronger. The galaxy would not remember his voice, but his shadow would remain long after his body turned to dust, long after the Jedi forgot the names carved into the temples, long after the Republic erased the war from its history. Because Naga Sadow had done what no Sith before him had managed. He had shown the galaxy what the Sith were capable of, and the galaxy would never forget the fear. Chapter 4. Darkness Between Wars. The Sith had fallen. Their empire, once stretched across the stars, had been broken, their temples abandoned, their fleets lost to fire and time. Naga Sadow had vanished into exile. Ludo Kresh was dust. The great cities of Ziost stood silent beneath cold moons, and the red sands of Korriban whispered only to the dead. But the dark side does not end. It hides. And in the years that followed the Great Hyperspace War, the Sith became something they had not been for centuries. They became memory. But memory has power. Korriban became a tomb world, not by design, but by consequence. Its temples, once filled with living voices, now echoed only with wind and ghosts. But those ghosts did not rest. The Force had been torn open too many times in those halls. The walls themselves remembered screams, the stones hummed with pain, and the tombs sealed to preserve history began to speak. Pilgrims came. Not many, never many, but enough. Outcasts, fallen Jedi, dark mystics seeking purpose in a galaxy that had no place for them. They walked through sandstorms and silence. They lit torches beneath the statues of dead lords, and they listened. Some came alone. Others came in pairs. A few never left. The temples did not welcome them. They tested them. Those who entered the tomb of Ajunta Pul sometimes heard their own voices whispering back. In the Valley of the Dark Lords, shadows moved where no light should have cast them. The tomb of Marka Ragnus, long buried in collapse, gave dreams to those who slept too close. Visions of war, of betrayal, of the moment everything fell apart, and how it could all rise again. The Sith were gone, but the idea was not, and ideas are hard to kill. Among the ruins of Korriban, something began to shift. Small groups formed, cults. Not all were strong. Many were mad, but a few held on to something ancient, a fragment of code, a piece of doctrine, an old relic still humming with power. Some were scavengers, some were seekers, but they all wanted the same thing: to bring the Sith back. They were not unified. They were not chosen. But they believed, and that belief was enough to keep the fire alive. Far away, on Yavin 4th, the jungle moon where Naga Sadow had hidden his final breath, another echo stirred. The Massassi had once been a people, warriors reshaped by Sith alchemy into monstrous forms. Mindless, obedient, deadly. Sadow had used them as tools, but even after he vanished, their bloodline endured. Twisted descendants roamed the jungles. Their temples stood like fangs in the green. And in those temples, the dark side waited, waiting for someone to return. Time passed, years into decades, decades into centuries, and across the galaxy, the Sith became a legend. The Republic believed they had ended. The Jedi believed they had been purged. But here and there, in tombs, in ruins, in haunted temples, the truth remained. The Sith had not died. They had changed shape. Some became spirits, bound to artifacts, whispering madness into the minds of the weak. Others became phantoms, trapped in the Force, offering knowledge at the price of sanity. And a few, a rare few, survived in flesh, hidden, masked, lost beneath new names. No armies, no empire, only shadows. But in those shadows, something stirred. The Force does not forget. And Corridin was not a grave. It was a seed. The war had ended. The Sith had vanished. But power does not disappear. It drifts, it lingers, and in the silence that followed Naga Sado's fall, a new generation began to rise, children of broken masters, born not in glory but in fear. They were not raised in temples. They were raised in ruins. Across the galaxy, remnants of the old Sith Empire had scattered like dust caught in a dying star. Some escaped into wild space. Others were buried beneath false identities on outer rim worlds. But even in exile, the Sith could not forget who they were. They whispered their truths in hidden chambers. They passed on teachings in code and pain. Their students did not sit in grand halls. They trained in basements, in caves, in dreams filled with burning stars. These apprentices were not chosen. They were taken, taught by masters who no longer believed in empires, only in survival. And still, they learned. They learned how to bend the Force through emotion, how to feed on anger and grow stronger in the dark, how to hide their presence from Jedi minds, how to bleed a crystal, how to kill with a word. Each master taught differently. There was no code, no unity, only memory and desperation. The apprentices carried it all. They became weapons without banners. In the unknown regions, a former warlord named Belaya Dazu created dark armor powered by enslaved spirits. On Drummond Kaz, storms gathered where no weather should have formed, driven by rituals long forgotten, performed by hands no Jedi ever saw. In the outer systems, rumors spread of Force wielders who could not be sensed, whose eyes glowed red in shadow, whose words could make men obey without thought. The Jedi dismissed these as legends, but they were not. They were the next generation, each one shaped by silence. Each one a child of failure. They had not seen the Empire rise, but they had memorized the stories of how it fell, and from those stories they took their lesson, not to fight too soon, not to show too much, to wait, to grow, to prepare in secret. And above all, to never trust another Sith. Many of these children turned on their own masters, killed them, replaced them. It was not considered betrayal. It was considered proof. The strong survive, the weak are remembered only through scars. This was not a tradition built on love or lineage. It was built on challenge. They did not seek each other, but their paths crossed. Sometimes in battle, sometimes in alliance that would last a single mission, sometimes in silence watching one another, wondering who would strike first. There were no councils, no seats of power, only ambition, and the dark side, feeding each of them in isolation. And through it all, something deeper moved. The Force itself had not recovered. It still bore the wound of the war. It still remembered the screams of Sado's sun flares, the madness in Kresh's death, the blood spilled in the Valley of the Dark Lords. It remembered every broken oath and twisted ritual. And in the quiet moments, when these young Sith meditated alone, they could feel it, something beneath the Force, beneath the stars. Waiting, calling. They did not know they were shaping the future. They only knew the past had not died. They felt it in their bones, in their anger, in the way the galaxy still trembled when they reached out with open hands. And even though they walked alone, they carried with them the same dream. That the Sith would rise again. But not as they were, as something more. They did not need armies to make the galaxy bleed. The Sith had once ruled with fire and fleets. Now they ruled with whispers, with secrets, with careful invisible hands that reached into places even the Jedi could not see. Their lightsabers stayed cold, but their influence, it was everywhere. Because corruption does not arrive as war, it arrives as trust. In the centuries that followed the Great Hyperspace War, the Republic grew bold again. Too bold. Peace turned into blindness. Systems once lost to the Sith were reabsorbed, their histories rewritten, their names changed in the archives. The Senate swelled, bureaucracy thickened, and in that growing, tangled structure, darkness crept in. Not all who served the Sith wore robes. Some wore official uniforms. Some sat in banking guilds, in planetary courts, in merchant fleets. They had no need to speak the Sith code aloud. They served the same hunger, greed, control, division, and in return, they were rewarded, quietly, safely. The Force moved through them even if they never touched it. Not all corruption begins with Force lightning. Some begins with a whisper in the right ear. And the Jedi, they felt something was wrong, but they could not name it. They searched for battles, for warriors with red blades, for planets turning dark. But the new Sith had learned. They no longer showed their strength in the open. They did not want to be seen. They wanted to be obeyed. A single word in the Senate could change the fate of an entire system, and no one would ever trace it back. Cultists re-emerged across the Mid-Rim, not in temples but in governments, in trade guilds, in criminal networks. On Denova, a senator disappeared after opposing a mysterious mining deal. On Brental, a fleet was recalled for unknown reasons, just days before a Republic world was raided by pirates. The Jedi began to suspect, but the clues were always incomplete. By the time they arrived, the damage had already been done. And always, someone benefited. These were not isolated crimes. They were patterns, patterns of control, patterns of influence, patterns the Jedi could not see in time because they still searched for the Sith of the past. But the Sith had evolved. They became ideas implanted in policy, weapons hidden in legislation, wars that began not with violence, but with trade disputes. And when systems fell into chaos, when crime spread, when people lost faith in the Republic's protection, the Sith smiled. Because fear once again was growing. And fear makes people easy to shape. In the Outer Rim, a Sith Lord known only as Darth Revan planted cults in refugee populations. They worshipped a god of balance, not realizing they were learning the early lines of Sith ideology. On Telos, a Force-sensitive bureaucrat passed laws that redirected temple funding away from Jedi outposts and toward silent allies. On Eriadu, entire families disappeared when they spoke too openly about secret meetings between senators and masked strangers. But there were no red lightsabers, no battles, no war, only a slow unraveling. And in the heart of it all, the Jedi continued to meditate, to teach, to train younglings in the temple without realizing the shadow had already reached the foundations beneath them. Because corruption was not coming, it had already arrived, and it had a face the Jedi would never recognize. Not yet. The Jedi Temple stood tall. Its towers stretched into the Coruscant sky, lit by the glow of 1,000 speeders. Inside, voices echoed through the stone halls. Younglings recited the code. Masters debated in council chambers. Archivists polished holocrons that had not been opened in centuries. It was a monument to peace, a place built to keep the darkness out. But the darkness was already inside. It did not scream. It whispered. In the dreams of certain Padawans, the Force bent in strange directions. Visions came, not warnings, not guidance, but memories that were not their own. A planet with 2 suns, a temple buried in vines, a voice calling them by names they did not know. Some spoke of it, most did not. They were told it was the Force, just teaching them in riddles. But the Force was not speaking alone. In the archives, an ancient scroll went missing. In the temple garden, a tree that had never bloomed grew black leaves overnight. On Ossus, a training vessel crashed during a routine landing, and the pilot, when found, had carved something into the wall of the cockpit. 2 words, in blood. Sith, live. The council buried the incident. Not out of malice, out of fear. Fear that they were no longer in control. Because the truth was, the Jedi had grown distant from the dark. Their war with the Sith had ended so long ago that it had become history, taught in classes, filed in holocrons, studied through lenses of doctrine. They had forgotten what it felt like, what it looked like, what it did. And so when darkness returned in fragments, they could not recognize it. A merchant family in the Mid-Rim began to display uncanny prosperity. Their son passed every Jedi test but failed his first mission and never returned. On Dantooine, a temple guardian took his own life after reporting that he could no longer hear the Force. And on Corellia, an old man spoke aloud in a market that the Sith had never been defeated. No one listened to him. But he was right. The Sith had not died. They had hidden beneath the light. In cults, in tombs, in bloodlines stretched thin across generations, they had learned to use time as a weapon. They no longer rushed, they waited, they watched, they whispered through corrupted holocrons, through cursed artifacts, through bloodlines shaped by rituals lost to the living. And all the while, the Jedi sat in meditation, searching for a shadow that had already wrapped itself around them. The Jedi were not blind, but their eyes were fixed on the past, and so they never saw the future that was quietly forming behind them. A future born not in war, but in waiting. A Sith Lord in hiding began to study immortality, not to conquer the galaxy, but to outlast it. Another built a school beneath a mountain, training children to strike from within. A third disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a trail of broken minds. Each was a whisper. Each was a seed. And one day those seeds would grow. Not in darkness, but in daylight. And when the Jedi finally saw it, it would already be too late. Chapter 5. Exar Kun and the Shadow Legacy. He was meant to be a savior. Exar Kun was not born into darkness. He was not shaped by war or raised in exile. He came from peace, from a time when the Republic stood tall and the Jedi Order was strong. He was a child of light, and for a while he believed in that light. But belief fades, and curiosity cuts deeper than any blade. Exar was not like other students. He did not struggle. He surpassed every lesson, every form, every meditation. He mastered them with ease. The masters praised him. His peers watched him. Some envied him. He was destined for greatness, they said. But Exar did not want to follow the path. He wanted to rewrite it. The Force came to him like breath, unforced and constant, but he felt something missing. A boundary he could not cross. He would sit in the archives long after the lights dimmed, searching old records for things left unsaid. He asked questions his teachers did not want to answer. Why must emotion be feared? Why must knowledge be hidden? Why must power be denied? He was told the usual answers. That passion leads to corruption. That darkness is always waiting. That the Sith had fallen, and their ways must remain buried. But Exar did not fear the Sith. He feared ignorance. He began to push. During sparring sessions, he grew more aggressive. His lightsaber struck harder, his movements faster, less restrained. In meditation, he struggled to quiet his thoughts. They raced toward forbidden places, toward ancient names etched into the stone of sealed chambers. Adjunta Pulse, Tulak Horde, Marka Ragnos. He wanted to know what they had known. And that was his first mistake. The Jedi Council grew concerned. They counseled patience. They warned him of pride, but they could not take the Force from him. They could not make him forget what he had already learned, and in their silence, they left him room to fall. When he asked about the dark side, he was told to fear it. When he asked what the Sith had truly been, he was told not to ask again. So he stopped asking and started looking. His journey took him beyond the temple, beyond Coruscant, to the outer worlds, where Jedi rarely walked, where ruins still echoed with the voices of the past. On Onderon, he studied the beast riders. On Dantooine, he searched the caves for crystals that hummed with strange resonance. On Ossus, he found fragments of texts that had no author. And through it all, he heard a whisper that said he was right, that he had always been right, that the Jedi had chained themselves to half-truths and called it wisdom. He was still a Jedi, but only in name. In truth, he had already begun to walk a path no one could follow, and in the shadows he stepped into, something began to follow him. It would not speak yet, but it watched. It waited. It knew the shape of Exarstit's ambition, and it knew how to feed it. There are places the Jedi are taught never to go, ancient tombs buried in forgotten worlds, temples that still bleed the energy of dark rituals, holocrons sealed by masters long dead. The Order does not hide these things out of fear. It hides them out of mercy, because what lies inside is not merely knowledge, it is hunger. And it always remembers the names of those who listen. Exar Kun listened. He traveled to Korriban. Not as a thief, not as an outlaw, but as a student. He told himself it was for truth, that understanding the Sith meant protecting the galaxy from them. But deep down, he was not seeking defense. He was seeking power. The Valley of the Dark Lords greeted him in silence. No flames, no visions, just stone, cold, cracked and breathing with the past. He walked alone through corridors lined with the faces of dead Sith. He felt the Force around him, thick, slow, heavy like ash in the lungs. His lightsaber felt small here, his thoughts loud, and in that quiet, something answered. A spirit, ancient, patient, a voice buried under layers of stone and time. Marka Ragnos, the last great ruler before the Empire collapsed into civil war. The voice did not threaten Exar. It welcomed him, not with warmth, with recognition. It saw his mind, it felt his pride, it fed on his pain, and it offered him what no Jedi ever had. A choice. Not between light and dark, between truth and restraint. The Jedi had taught him fear. Ragnos offered clarity. The Force is not divided, it is only denied. Passion is not a weakness, it is the source of power. Exar did not need to destroy the Jedi. He only needed to become more than them. He left Korriban changed. Not corrupted, not yet, but marked. He returned to the Order colder, quieter, his confidence sharper, no longer worn with arrogance, but carried like a blade. He challenged his masters with calm words and hidden contempt. He believed they had failed the galaxy, that their fear of the past had made them blind to the future. So he went further. He traveled to Yavin Thorf, a jungle moon soaked in history, once home to Naga Seto's final refuge. There in the temples of the Masasi, he found something far worse than a spirit. He found a prison, and inside that prison, a presence, dark, endless, watching him not as a student, but as a vessel. Exar entered the temple believing he was still in control. He was wrong. The spirit within had been waiting for someone strong enough, proud enough, blind enough to believe that he could touch the deepest shadow and still walk away whole. The moment Exar reached out, it entered him. Not fully, not all at once, but the bond was made. Exar collapsed, his body seizing, his mind spiraling. Visions flooded him, of worlds burning, of temples collapsing, of armies kneeling, and above them all, a throne carved in fire, with no name and no mercy. When he rose, his eyes had changed, not in color, in silence, because inside him, something else had begun to wake. and it would never sleep again. There are friendships that become chains. Ulic Qel-Droma was not a stranger to courage. He was a war hero, trained at the side of masters who believed in order and duty. He carried a blade with the steady hands of a man who had seen terrible things and still chosen to stand. The galaxy remembered him as a hero long before it would learn to remember his name with dread. He had a brother, Kay, and a life that seemed built of simple pillars: honor, duty, loyalty. Ixar found him at a fracture. Ulic was not searching for darkness. He was searching for answers. The wounds of battle will hollow a man. They leave rooms in the mind where ghosts can sit. Ulic had walked through fires that did not burn his skin, but which singed his trust. He had seen leaders fail and innocence vanish, and the questions he carried were like knives that would not be sheathed by polite counsel. Ixar came with words that matched the knives. He spoke of truth hidden beneath law. He spoke of power that the Order refused to teach. He did not speak as a tyrant. He spoke as someone who had seen the edge and would not blink. To a restless warrior, those words were a kind of mercy. To a proud young knight, they were temptation dressed like purpose. They joined. It was not a simple falling. It was an alliance born of broken things. Ulic brought to Ixar the sharpness of battlefield training and a ferocity that could rally others. Ixar brought the hunger for ancient knowledge and the patient cruelty of someone who had learned the old rites. Together they forged a brotherhood that the Jedi had not planned for and could not stop. Their union changed men. Where Ulic had once followed orders, he now made them. He led campaigns that burned whole systems. He struck at foes with the speed of a blade and the precision of a surgeon. The people who had once cheered him as a champion began to whisper his name with fear. He moved like a man who had given his doubts to a different god and found that the god demanded more than gratitude. It demanded sacrifice. And sacrifice grew like rot. The first great wound came in the city of Nosa, where a fight with his own brother Kay ended in madness. Anger spilled from Ulic in a way none of his masters had ever seen. A brother fell beneath his hand. The ground where it happened became stained, not only with blood, but with a memory that would never fade. When a Jedi kills a brother, the Force marks that act. It does not forget. It waits. Ixar watched all of this and did not look away. He did not need to. The bond between them was not equal. Ixar was the mind shaping the music. Ulic was the instrument. When Ulic broke, the sound reverberated through Ixar's plans. He used the break. He fed it. He turned grief into fury, and then taught that fury to others. The brotherhood of Sith that grew around them was less a school than an epidemic. They taught not doctrine but contagion. Each new recruit learned to hate what they once loved. And yet there were moments of a different kind. In strange, brief hours, Ulic would remember what he had been. He would look at the stars and see his younger self reflected, and something like regret would pass across his face. He would kneel not in prayer, but in fatigue. Ixar would not comfort him. He would remind him of destiny. In that way, the friendship became a command. It would not end in triumph. The tide of their war turned in ways neither expected. Ulic was captured. He was torn from the current Ixar himself had created. The Jedi who found him did not simply punish him. They cut his connection to the Force, and in that cutting there was both cruelty and mercy. A man who had been a weapon was made hollow to prevent him from hurting anymore. He was left alive to feel the choice he had made. Ixar reacted differently. He did not grieve. He burned. He became a spirit that refused to die, haunting temples and armies long after the bodies of his brothers fell. The Brotherhood dissolved into legend and horror. Ulic, broken and mute to the Force, would be remembered as warning. Ixar, alive in history as a dark thing that would not let go, became an echo across centuries. Their friendship had been born from similar needs: answers, purpose, escape. In the end, it taught the galaxy a different lesson. It showed how love can twist into ownership, how loyalty can become a chain, and how two men bound once by honor can remake the world and then be remade by the very darkness they embraced. Yavin Vav did not forget. Long after Exar Kun's body vanished, long after the Jedi scorched his temples and buried his armies, something remained. Not a memory, not a ruin, a presence. Exar had not planned to become a spirit. He had not sought immortality the way others would, through ritual or legend. He had simply refused to lose. And in the final moments of the war, when the Jedi had surrounded him, when the temples of the Massassi began to fall, Exar made a choice that the Force itself could not undo. He shattered his own flesh, but not his will. He bound his essence into the walls, into the stones, into the roots of the jungle that had once obeyed him. His followers, now half-beasts twisted by Sith alchemy, were sacrificed to anchor the ritual. Their blood soaked the stone. Their screams were absorbed into the wood. When the Jedi finally breached the temple, they found only dust. But the darkness had not left. It had only grown still. Time passed. Centuries. The Republic changed. The Jedi changed. Wars came and went. And still Yavin 4th stood green, silent and waiting. Travelers came sometimes. Archaeologists, smugglers, none stayed long. The jungle swallowed their tracks. The temples whispered in languages they did not know, and those who slept too close to the ruins dreamed of voices they had never heard. The voice was always his, Exar Kun, the Sith who had refused death. He was not alone in the Force, but he was apart, trapped between life and memory. He wandered his own temples in thought, sometimes furious, sometimes silent. Time does not heal spirits. It only sharpens their edges. Exar's mind, once brilliant and vast, became something else, something focused only on returning. And then someone came. A student, young, angry, powerful. His name was Gantoris. It began again. Exar did not reveal himself at once. He whispered, suggested. He allowed the young man to believe the voice was his own inner strength. He offered power, not commands, and when Gantoris fell, burned from the inside by power he could not contain, another arrived. Kip Duron. The boy had been broken by the Empire, imprisoned, tortured, raised in pain and hatred. He carried the dark side already. Exar only needed to show him how to use it, and Kip listened. Because pain listens. Exar taught him how to wield power that the Jedi had long forbidden. He filled Kip's heart with righteous fire. He made him believe that vengeance was justice, that the Jedi were afraid of strength, that he was not a student but a weapon. And Kip believed him. The damage that followed would scar the galaxy. The Jedi thought they were training a new generation, but they had awakened something ancient. Exar did not fully return. His time had passed. His body was gone. His empire reduced to stories, but his shadow walked again through a student's hands, and in that shadow the Jedi saw something terrible, that the Sith do not need bodies. They only need belief. And belief once planted grows in silence. Exar Kun, the spirit who refused to die, had become more than a man. He had become a warning. One that would echo through every master who saw doubt in a student's eyes, through every apprentice who studied the past too long, through every Force user who wondered if the Jedi were right to bury the truth. He did not live again, but he was never truly gone. Chapter 6, Revan, the Jedi who broke. Before the mask, before the name, before the shadow ever touched him, he was light. Revan was not born into war, but he was shaped by its edge, raised within the Jedi Order. During a time of peace, he was gifted, curious, and impossibly brilliant. His mind grasped the Force with ease, and his words held the weight of someone destined to lead. He asked questions most students never dared to form. He read texts that others skipped, and he learned faster than any master could teach him. He became a symbol. The Republic saw him as a future savior. The Jedi saw him as dangerous, because Revan did not obey blindly. He followed truth wherever it led. Even when that path cut through sacred ground, he questioned the code, not out of defiance but out of conviction. And the Order, for all its teachings, could not quiet someone who truly believed in change. They called him the Golden Knight. And for a time he lived up to the name. He was noble, brilliant, unmatched in his mastery of the Force. But it was more than his skill that made others follow him. It was his certainty. When Revan spoke, people listened. When he moved, others moved with him. His charisma was not a mask, it was a force of nature. He studied history deeply, especially the conflicts the Jedi refused to dwell on. Exar Kun Naga Sado, the Sith Wars of old. Where others saw warnings, Revan saw patterns, lessons, tools. He believed that ignoring the past was a mistake. He believed the Jedi were too passive, too slow, that their fear of darkness had left the Republic vulnerable. And then the Mandalorians came. Armies from the Outer Rim, ruthless, united under a single code, strength above all. They burned through unprepared systems, conquering world after world. The Republic pleaded with the Jedi Council to act, but the Council hesitated. Revan did not. He stepped forward, not as a soldier, but as a shield. He left the Order, took Jedi with him. Knights, Padawans, warriors, who had once sworn to remain neutral now followed Revan into battle. They called themselves the Revanchists. The Council begged him to return, warned him that war would change him, that stepping outside the code would not lead to peace, but to ruin. He did not listen. Because Revan believed the Republic would fall without him. And perhaps he was right. He led brilliantly, ruthlessly. His strategies were unlike anything the Mandalorians had faced. He predicted their moves before they made them. His army did not just fight, they won. Planet by planet, system by system. He became a legend while still wearing Jedi robes. But the war asked for more than skill. It demanded something deeper, and the Force, it began to change around him. His methods grew colder, his victories came at higher costs. He authorized bombings that killed civilians to cut supply lines. He justified it, said every life lost would save 1,000 more. But something inside him had begun to harden. The mask had not yet touched his face, but the man behind it was already disappearing. And in the silence between battles, something darker began to whisper. Not in words, but in hunger. A hunger he did not yet recognize, but which recognized him. The war dragged on, and with each victory, Revan lost something. The Jedi who followed him began to change. They called him Commander Revan now. Some even said Lord. No one dared question his orders, not anymore. What began as a crusade to protect the Republic had become something else, something more precise, more controlled, more dangerous. Revan's tactics were brilliant, but merciless. The lines he had once sworn to protect blurred, then vanished. He told himself it was necessary, that the cost of peace was always high, that he was still Jedi in spirit, even if his robes no longer reflected the code. But somewhere deep within he had stopped hearing the Force the way he once had, and something else had taken its place. The turning point was not a battle, it was a decision. The Mandalorians had fortified their final stand at Malachor V, a world forgotten by most, cursed by others. A place where the Force itself was fractured, the surface cracked with wounds that bled energy, the gravity twisted, the air hummed with death. The Jedi would never have fought there. Revan did not hesitate. He brought his entire fleet, positioned a superweapon, the mass shadow generator, into orbit. It was designed to collapse gravity upon itself, to tear enemy ships and the planet's crust apart in an instant. But there were allies on the ground, soldiers, Jedi, civilians. Revan activated it anyway. The blast shattered Malachor Ver. The crust of the world folded in. Ships were crushed mid-flight. Cities crumbled. Thousands of lives, Republic and Mandalorian alike, were lost in silence. What remained of the planet was no longer a place. It was a wound. And Revan stood above it, calm, still, alone. The war was over. He had won. But he had not returned from that battle. The man who had once walked the temple halls with light in his eyes had buried something on that broken world. He spoke less, smiled never. Those closest to him, Malak, Mitra Surik and others, felt the shift. Revan was no longer fighting to save the Republic. He was preparing to reshape it. Because in the Outer Rim, beyond the known systems, he had found something else. A voice. Not Mandalorian, not Jedi, not even Sith. A presence. It called to him through dark hyperspace, through the remains of ancient Sith temples, through relics older than the Republic itself. It spoke of the true Sith, of an empire that had never died, of a threat that would return. And Revan, already broken, listened. He believed the Republic would not survive unless it was reforged, controlled, strengthened through pain. The Jedi would never understand. The Senate would never agree, so he would take control, end their cycle of weakness. He turned to the dark side not out of hate, but out of necessity. He told himself it was the only way, and in that decision, he stopped being a Jedi. He and Malak vanished into the unknown regions. What they found there was never fully known. Only pieces remained. Whispers of old Sith Lords, temples lost to time, empires that fed on stars. They returned with new names, new armor, new power, and a plan. The Republic they had fought to save, they now sought to conquer. And the Jedi Order that had raised them, they would bring it to its knees. Revan was no longer seeking peace. He was seeking control, not for glory. But because he believed no one else was strong enough to do what had to be done, he did not see himself as fallen. He saw himself as chosen. The ashes of war had barely cooled when the new war began. Revan returned not as a savior, but as a conqueror. His ships, black and sharp like blades, cut through Republic space without warning. His armies wore no Jedi robes. Their armor was sleek, faceless and cold. His flagship, the Leviathan, was a fortress that moved like a ghost across the stars. The Republic called it a betrayal. But for Revan, it was a beginning. He had not returned to destroy. He had returned to reshape. The coronation did not happen in a palace or a chamber. It happened on a graveyard. Malachor Ver, the place he had broken with his own hands, had become his throne. The mass shadow generator had fractured the planet, but it had also revealed something buried beneath its surface, an ancient Sith academy, hidden in shadow for thousands of years. A wound beneath a wound. It welcomed him. He descended alone. The halls were not empty. Echoes of rituals long forgotten bled from the walls. Stone corridors twisted in unnatural ways. The air felt thick, like it was watching him. At the heart of it stood a chamber, carved in darkness, lined with altars that had not seen life in millennia. There, Revan knelt, not in submission, in command. The dark side did not strike him with lightning or visions. It did not seduce. It recognized him. It folded around his mind like a second skin. The ancient knowledge flooded in, not from a single master, but from the walls themselves, from the air, from the bones beneath his feet, from Malachor itself. He stood changed. He was no longer a Jedi, and the name Revan was no longer his alone. He had become something more, something ancient, something crowned. Darth Revan. The title was not a costume. It was a truth. The mask he wore was not to hide who he had been, but to seal it away. The Jedi was gone. The general was gone. The man who had once knelt to the council no longer existed. He had killed that part of himself when he broke Malachor. Now he had risen from the ashes. Darth Malak followed, loyal, hungry. He shaved his head and took a name in honor of Revan. But there was a difference between them. Subtle at first, invisible to others, Revan planned with precision, controlled every move, every whisper, every death. Malak wanted victory, Revan wanted vision. They marched together. Worlds fell in silence before their fleets. Jedi were captured and corrupted. Some broke, some joined willingly. The Republic reeled. It had never seen war like this. Not from outside, not from within, because these Sith were not old warlords resurrected from tombs. They were Jedi who had learned every strength of the light and turned them against it. But even as he conquered, Revan remembered the greater threat. He still saw the true Sith in his mind, still felt their presence beyond the edge of the map. And he feared them. He feared what they might become. And so every world he crushed was not about revenge. It was preparation. He believed the Republic would not survive unless it was reforged in fire, that only through control could it be made strong enough to resist what was coming. He believed his rule was not tyranny, it was protection. His war was not hatred, it was prophecy. But belief is not always enough, and power rarely stays loyal. Darth Malak, once his closest friend, began to hunger for more. Where Revan saw strategy, Malak saw hesitation. Where Revan spared planets for their value, Malak destroyed them for their defiance. Where Revan wore the mask as a symbol, Malak began to wonder what it might mean to take it for himself. And so the betrayal came. Not from the Republic, not from the Jedi, but from the one who had sworn to follow him into darkness. Betrayal came from above. Revan stood on the bridge of his flagship, issuing commands that could shape entire sectors. Victory was within reach. The Republic had begun to fracture. The Jedi were scrambling, and Malak, ever faithful, had been dispatched to crush the resistance near the Outer Rim. But Malak returned too soon, and he brought fire. Without warning, he turned his guns on Revan's own vessel, his own master. It was not out of hate, not fully. It was impatience. Malak believed Revan had grown too cautious, that he was holding the Sith back from complete dominance, that the Republic should have already fallen. And so, with a single order, Malak did what so many Sith before him had done. He struck at his master. The blast tore through the flagship. Dozens died. The bridge collapsed into silence. But Revan did not die, because someone else had arrived at the moment of destruction. A Jedi strike team had boarded the ship, led by Bastila Shan, a young woman gifted in battle meditation, strong in the Force. She confronted Revan at the edge of his war, and in the chaos of Malak's betrayal, she spared his life. She pulled him from the wreckage, unconscious, shattered in body and mind. She did not know why. Only that the Force had told her to. And so the Jedi did what they always feared to do. They rewrote him. They took what remained of Revan and rebuilt it. No memories, no mask, no name. He awoke on a Republic ship with no past, only instincts, and even those came slowly. He did not know he had once commanded legions. He did not know that the galaxy cursed his name. He only knew that the dark side whispered in fragments through his sleep, that something inside him was broken, and something else was still watching. As he traveled with the Republic, hunted by Malak and the Sith he had once created, Revan began to remember, not through facts but through feelings, through pain, through choices that seemed strangely familiar. He met Bastila again not as an enemy, but as a guide, and together they traced his own path, backward. They went to the worlds he had once ruled. Korriban, Kashyyyk, Manaan, Lehon. Each step peeled away a layer of the mask he no longer wore. He saw what he had done, what he had become, and what he had almost destroyed. But something was different now. Revan was not a Jedi, not fully, and he was no longer Sith. He was the space between those words, a wound held together by will alone. When he confronted Malak at last, it was not as a master reclaiming his throne, it was as a man facing his reflection. Malak died in defiance, still convinced that power was the answer, that strength was worth any price. But Revan had changed. He had walked through every corridor of his own failure and survived. He did not return to the Jedi Order with triumph. He returned with silence. They called him a hero. They whispered that perhaps redemption was real. But Revan knew better. He had not been redeemed. He had simply been reminded of who he once was and who he could still become. But he also remembered what lay beyond the unknown regions. He remembered the voice, the true Sith, the threat greater than himself, than Malak, than any war the galaxy had ever known. And so quietly, without fanfare or farewell, he left, disappeared beyond the edges of the map, not to conquer, not to escape, but to finish what he had begun. And the Force did not follow him. It waited, because the Jedi who broke was still broken. But sometimes, broken pieces are sharpest. Chapter 7. Darth Nihilus, the Sith who should not exist. He did not begin with a name, only a scream. It came at the end of the Mandalorian Wars, at the edge of known space, where stars flickered like dying eyes. A place called Malachor V, a place already soaked in death. But when Revan activated the mass shadow generator, the world broke open in ways the galaxy had never seen. Ships were crushed, lives erased, the Force itself ruptured. And from that rupture, something survived. Not a soldier, not a Sith. A wound. He had once been a man. He had once walked among others, fought beside them, bled like them. But on Malachor, his soul was torn from certainty. The Force was ripped from the ground and sky, and everything in him that was whole came apart. He did not die. He emptied, and something else filled the space where his identity had been. Pain, silence, hunger. He wandered the ruins after the explosion, drawn to shadows that moved without light. He did not speak. He could not. Words require shape, and he had none. Even the Force recoiled from him. Where others reached out to feel it, he consumed it without meaning to. Life faded in his presence. Wounds worsened. The sick collapsed. He did not attack them. They simply died near him. He did not understand why. He only knew that he needed more. The Jedi had no word for what he was. The Sith at that time had no doctrine that could contain him. But someone found him. Someone who had long walked the edges of darkness, watching for power that did not belong. Darth Traya. She took him in, not out of pity, out of fascination. In him she saw a new kind of Sith, one that did not desire power, but required it, one that could not be reasoned with, because there was nothing left inside him to reason with. He did not seek to dominate. He sought to feed. She gave him a name. Darth Nihilus. He did not protest. He could not. But the name held. It became his mask. Traya taught him how to survive, how to focus the hunger, how to feed on Force-sensitive life. But she could not control him. His power grew too quickly, and his understanding of it remained alien, even to himself. What began as ritual became instinct. He no longer knew where his hunger ended and the dark side began. And in time, he turned on her. He was no longer a student. He was a void, and he would never be whole again. He drifted across the galaxy in a ship called the Ravager, half wreckage, half monument. Its crew were lifeless husks, bound to his will not by loyalty, but by hunger. They were already dead. They just had not stopped moving. And at the center of it all, behind robes that no longer held flesh, behind a mask that held no face, stood a Sith Lord who should never have existed. He did not breathe. He did not think in ways others could measure. He was not a man corrupted by the dark side. He was the dark side corrupted by absence. a hollow echo of power that had lost its shape and now consumed everything around it just to remember what it felt like to exist. He was not evil. He was need, a wound that had learned how to walk. There is a hunger that comes from the body, a hunger for food, for warmth, for survival. It rises and it passes. But Darth Nihilus did not hunger like that. His need had no rhythm, no relief, no pause. It was constant, all-consuming. He did not crave to feel full. He craved only to delay the moment when the emptiness inside him would collapse in on itself, when the force around him would no longer be enough, when even devouring entire worlds would fail to keep the silence at bay. He was not growing stronger. He was staying alive. By destroying life, his first target was Qatar, a world of Meraluka, force-sensitive beings born without sight, who saw through the force itself. They were peaceful, wise, many were Jedi. The council had gathered there in secret, hoping to meditate away the storm they felt growing. They did not understand that the storm had already arrived. Nihilus did not send a fleet. He did not demand surrender. He did not land. He simply opened himself. And the world went silent. Not with fire, not with war, with emptiness. The Meraluka died without ever drawing a weapon. Their temples fell, their voices vanished, their spirits erased. The Force, too, recoiled. It screamed as an entire planet's presence was swallowed in a breath that did not come from lungs. When it was done, only one survived. A woman named Visas Ma. Blinded from birth, she had seen the galaxy through the Force, and now she had seen it torn away. Nihilus took her, not out of compassion, but because something in her had endured his hunger. She became his servant, not bound by chains, bound by pity. She saw the void within him and understood it in ways he could not. He did not speak. His voice was a tremor in the mind, an echo of a thought remembered too late. But Visas heard it. She heard what no one else could, that behind the mask he was still screaming. But the scream had gone on for so long it had lost its meaning. From Qatar, he moved outward. Wherever the Jedi fled, he followed, not because he hated them, but because their presence in the Force was louder, brighter, more nourishing. He consumed enclaves like a fire consumes dry leaves. He left no survivors, no messages, no warnings. And the Jedi began to understand that they were not facing an enemy. They were facing extinction. The Republic called him a Sith, but that word no longer meant what it once had. He did not command legions in the way Revan had. He did not shape ideology the way Bane would. Nihilus was not building anything. He was unmaking. And there was no end in sight. He formed an alliance with Darth Sidious, another broken creature who could not die. Together they rebuilt the Sith Triumvirate in name only. Alongside Darth Trier, who had once named him, they stood as three ruins held together by pain, but where Sidious relied on fury and Trier on deception. Nihilus needed only proximity. He drained his own allies when they stood too close, not by intent, but by nature. He was not a lord of passion. He was starvation personified, a soul so fractured that it had become a vacuum. Even the Force began to tremble in his presence. Masters who had never known fear began to forget how to feel anything else. It was said that he could walk into a Jedi temple and leave nothing but dust and bones behind, not by raising a hand, but simply by existing. He was not the strongest Sith. He was the emptiest, and emptiness, when fed long enough, becomes the deadliest shape the Force can take. He did not lead. He drifted. The galaxy no longer understood how to fight something that did not speak, did not want, and did not stop. Darth Nihilus was not building an empire. He had no laws, no planets, no currency, no citizens. He had only his ship, and the absence it carried with it. The Ravager. A once destroyed vessel held together by Force energy and hate, its hull broken, its systems dead. And yet it moved without engines, without logic, guided only by his will. Nihilus did not walk its halls as a man. He floated like ash on a dying wind. The crew were not alive, not truly. They served not out of loyalty, but because they had no choice. Their minds were husks, hollowed out and held together by the same hunger that fueled him. The Ravager became legend. When it appeared above a world, it was already too late. Communications failed, the Force dimmed, and then the silence spread. People collapsed mid-prayer. Jedi dropped their sabers and fell without wounds. Children cried once and never again. Animals stopped breathing. Plants withered. Nihilus did not kill out of cruelty. He killed because the galaxy could no longer satisfy what he had become. One world after another fell. Outer Rim colonies, hidden Jedi enclaves, refugee routes. It was not a war, it was a pattern. And then Nihilus turned his gaze to tell us the fourth. A Republic restoration world, protected, armed, the last hope for rebuilding what the Sith had torn down. He wanted it not for strategy, but for fuel. He sensed a concentration of Force life, stronger than the rest. He moved the Ravager into orbit. But this time, someone had been waiting. The Jedi exile. She had once served under Revan. She had fought at Malachor V and walked away broken. Like Nihilus, she carried a wound in the Force, but unlike him, she had found meaning in her silence. She had learned to live with it. He had become it. She boarded the Ravager not as a warrior, but as a mirror. The battle between them was not of lightsabers alone, it was of presence. The hunger he unleashed tried to consume her, but she did not fight back with strength. She fought with absence. Where he sought to devour her connection to the Force, she offered none. And in that moment, his hunger failed. He could not feed on what she no longer gave. He staggered. The silence turned against him. His strength began to crumble. He had never imagined that someone could survive without the Force, that someone could carry a wound and still find purpose, that pain could become peace. He lashed out, but it was already over. The exile struck him down. The mask fell, and there was no body beneath it. No face, no voice, only air. He had not worn the mask, he had become it. The armor crumbled, the void unraveled, the presence faded, and the galaxy exhaled. But the damage had already been done. The Jedi Order was in ruins, dozens of worlds had been erased, thousands of lives gone. Nihilus had not ruled the galaxy, but he had changed it. He was the reminder that the Force could break. And when it did not create monsters, it created emptiness. He was gone, but the silence remained. The death of Darth Nihilus did not end with triumph. There was no parade, no monument, no lasting peace, only quiet. Jedi survivors stood in the ruins of what he had left behind and listened for the Force, but something had changed. The galaxy was still breathing, but differently, as if afraid that drawing too much life would summon him again. Because Darth Nihilus had not been a Sith in the way others had. He had been something deeper, more fractured, more final. A manifestation of what happens when the Force is torn apart and never healed. A question left unanswered for too long. A scream held in until it swallows the voice entirely. He left no holocrons, no doctrine, no apprentices who truly understood him. Not even Visas Ma, who had walked at his side and lived beneath his shadow, could fully explain what he was. She spoke of pain, of loneliness so deep it had devoured identity. She described him as a wound that forgot how to close, and yet even she had felt pity. Because she had seen what lay behind the mask. Not a Sith Lord, not a god, just a man who had lost everything, and had mistaken that loss for power. The Jedi would later debate how to classify him. A dark side aberration, a wound in the Force, a consequence of Malachor V, But the truth was simpler than any archive would admit. He should never have existed. And because he did, the galaxy could never be the same. Malachor was not just a battlefield, it was a lesson. It taught that the Force could be weaponized in ways even the Sith had not imagined, that rituals meant to bind power could sometimes unmake the soul, that when you strip away purpose, identity and love, you do not get strength. You get hunger. And hunger, once it learns how to feed, never stops. The true Sith, those who waited beyond the unknown regions, heard of Nihilus, perhaps they even watched. Perhaps they whispered among themselves that such power was flawed, that such chaos was beneath their vision. But deep down, even they must have feared what he became. Because Nihilus did not seek domination. He sought to fill a void that could not be filled. And there is nothing more dangerous in the galaxy than someone who destroys only to delay their own collapse. Even centuries later, those who touch the dark side speak of him with caution. Some claim his mask still calls out from where it fell. That if you listen too long in the ruins of the Ravager, you can still hear his voice, not as sound, but as a pressure in the chest, as a feeling that something is reaching into you, trying to find the part of your spirit it can feed on. The exile tried to forget him, but memory clings hardest to silence. And Nihilus was silence, made flesh. He did not die with rage. He did not plead. He faded. Because that is what voids do. They disappear into everything they have consumed, and leave only echoes behind. Echoes that remind the Jedi, the Sith, the galaxy, that when the Force is wounded deeply enough, it does not scream, it starves. Chapter 8. Darth Bane and the Rule of Two. He was not born Darth Bane. He was born Decel, a child of the Outer Rim, a slave to his father's rage, a miner on Epatros. Every day was ash, blood, and silence. His hands were broken long before his spirit ever cracked. He learned how to take a punch before he learned how to read. In a place where breathing was pain, hatred became warmth. He did not know it then, but the Force had already found him. It lived in his anger. It whispered when he fought, when he survived wounds that should have killed him, when he saw things before they happened, when his enemies never saw his fists coming until they were already falling. And when he finally killed his father, with one hand pressed gently to his chest and his rage sharpened into thought, the Force did not punish him. It thanked him. That moment, that fracture, it was the beginning. He left Epatros, fled into the galaxy like a knife in search of something to cut. The Brotherhood of Darkness found him, not the ancient Sith Lords of tombs and temples, but the new breed, the army of Khan, 1,000 Sith who called each other brother, who pretended that unity and darkness could live in the same breath. They took him in, gave him armor, gave him a name. But Decel never forgot who he was, and more importantly, he never forgot what the Sith were supposed to be. He saw through their games, their shallow war, their titles passed between the weak like wine between cowards. He watched as the Brotherhood bled itself dry against the Jedi, thinking numbers could replace power, that votes could decide who led the dark side. He listened, and he judged. And when he found the ancient texts, when he uncovered the teachings of Darth Revan, it all made sense. The Sith had lost their way. The dark side was not meant to be shared. It was meant to be ruled. One master, one apprentice. No more, no less. The strong should rise, the weak should fall, not because of hatred alone, but because the galaxy demanded balance, and the dark side was nature's correction. He stopped being Decel. He became Darth Bane. He did not scream his truth. He waited, he trained, he studied in the shadow of Corrupion's tombs, listening to the dead. He drank from their wisdom. He allowed the spirits of the past to judge him, and they did not destroy him. They chose him. He found the holocron of Revan, learned the true nature of power, saw the foolishness of armies made of Sith pretending to be equals. He saw the only way forward. The Sith had to die, all of them. Not by Jedi hands, but by his. And he would be the one to do it. He would end them, and begin something new, something eternal. Darth Bane walked into the Sith Academy on Korriban, and he did not speak for days. He listened, he watched, and what he saw sickened him. Acolytes who thought cruelty was strength, masters who feared being challenged, a hierarchy that rewarded submission, not power. The teachings were diluted, stripped of their meaning, paraded as tradition, but hollowed by fear. This was not the Sith he had read about, not the Order Revan had described. This was a shadow pretending to be fire, and it disgusted him. So he chose pain, he chose solitude. While others schemed, Bane studied. While others poisoned, Bane bled. He threw himself into the ancient texts, the forgotten rituals, the teachings locked behind fear. He sparred until his arms failed, meditated until he starved, trained until his bones cracked beneath the weight of his own will. The other students laughed at him. For a while, until they began to lose. Until one by one they fell to him in the sparring ring. Until the instructors began to fear his gaze. Until the headmaster realized something terrible. Darth Bane was no longer learning from the academy. He was surpassing it. They tried to control him, tried to hold him back. One of the masters even poisoned him, hoping to remove the threat. Bane did not die. He disappeared into the Valley of the Dark Lords, into the tombs of Marka Ragnos, Naga Sado, and Ayunta Pal, into the past, where the real Sith still lived. He wandered the forgotten chambers, spoke to the spirits of ancient power, and there, in the silence of the dead, he was reforged. The old Sith did not care for titles. They did not care for unity. They demanded sacrifice. And Bane gave it. His own body became his crucible. He learned the secrets of Sith sorcery, the ancient techniques of battle meditation, and drain life. He did not ask to be taught. He took knowledge like a blade takes blood. And when he returned to the Brotherhood, he was different. He no longer played their games. He no longer debated. He had come back with one goal: to burn it all down. And for that, he needed a weapon. Not a blade, not an army. A legacy. He would be the last Sith of the old order, and the first of something new. He would carry the rule of two like a torch in the void. One master, one apprentice, one to embody the power, the other to crave it. This was not mercy. It was control. Because the Sith did not fail because of the Jedi. They failed because they could not stop destroying themselves. Bane would not make that mistake. But first, he had to become extinction. He had to become fire. He had to kill them all. The Brotherhood of Darkness believed itself a cure. Skeri Khan had convinced dozens of broken Sith to set aside old rivalries. They would act as one body. Numbers would replace treachery. The galaxy would be crushed beneath the weight of their unity. They called themselves brothers and wore the word like armor. They believed they had solved the sickness that had always eaten the dark side from within. Darth Bane knew they were wrong. He had watched them from the edges. He had seen how titles were handed out like candy. He had watched masters protect their place instead of sharpening their craft. He had watched the Brotherhood die a little more every time they chose compromise over cruelty, and so he planned. They tried to stop him. Kain sent Qasim, his blade master, to bring Bane back. Qasim was a warrior and a killer, a man who could read a strike before it happened. He hunted Bane to Lehon, where Bane had found the remnants of old Sith knowledge. They fought in the crumbling halls of an ancient Rakatan temple. The duel ended with Qasim dead, and Bane standing over him, breathing like a machine that had finally warmed up. Khan tried again. He sent his agent Githany to poison the exile. She slipped venom into his food, a slow-acting toxin meant to leave pain, but no chance to fight back. Bane did not die. He survived both blade and poison. Each attempt only taught him what he already knew, that the Brotherhood could not be reformed by numbers. It had to be ended. So he gave Khan a gift. Not a blade, not a crown. A text, a ritual written on flims, a set of instructions for a weapon older than empires. The thought bomb was described in careful hand, the way to gather the dark side, to bind it into a shape, to detonate it with will. To those who desired annihilation, the ritual promised a final solution. Khan received the scroll like a blessing. He called it a means to end the war. He called it necessary. Bane called it something colder, a way to close a wound he could not heal by argument. The seventh battle of Ruusan unfolded like a trap set long before the moon fell. Armies met in red dust and carved stone. The Jedi fought with the last of their prayers. The Sith deployed every unit they had. The dead lined the valleys. It was archaic in its brutality. Knees in mud, breath on the wind, names carved on stones. And then, in a cavern beneath the battlefield, the thought bomb was primed. Khan intended to use it against the Jedi. He intended to end them and claim a victory that would justify everything. He did not know the scroll had been a tool of betrayal. He did not know that the weapon he wielded would not spare his own. When the thought bomb detonated, it did not discriminate. It did not judge. It unmade. In a single terrible instant, the force around Ruusan was torn as if by a knife. Hundreds of Jedi died. Hundreds of Sith died. The cave became a wound in the galaxy, a place where souls had been rent and scattered like ashes on the wind. Those who had not been vaporized in the blast were broken by it. Minds snapped. Bodies trembled. The Jedi, with their code and their mercy, gathered the survivors and called it an end. They believed that the Sith were finished. Bane watched the aftermath with cold eyes. He had not simply sent a weapon, he had sent a rebirth. The Brotherhood no longer existed in any useful shape. Kayan and his favored lords were gone. The armies were scattered, the Sith had been cut down by their own hand, and the Jedi carried the weight of their own cost. The new Sith wars had burned themselves out in a single devastating fire. And when the smoke cleared, one figure remained where dozens had stood before. Darth Bane. He walked through the silence that followed like a man stepping into a cleared field after a storm. There were no cheers, there were no crowns. There was only the knowledge that the old had died and that something new could be born from that death. He had not sought to rule by numbers or votes. He sought to save the dark side by purifying it, by making it efficient, patient, and lethal in a way the Brotherhood never was. He took a pupil. Not a council, not an army. Bane took a child gifted in secrecy and patience. He trained her in ways the Brotherhood had forgotten. He taught her to hide and to strike, to plot and to wait. He made a rule that would sound simple to those who did not know history: 2 Sith at a time, 1 master, 1 apprentice. It was a brutal idea. It was also a necessary one. The rule of 2 was not a plea for peace. It was a method of survival. The Sith had destroyed themselves when they tried to be many. So Bane made them few. The galaxy thought the Sith had been buried in Ruusan's dust. They were wrong. They had only been remade. In the stillness after the purge, Darth Bane was not celebrated. There were no monuments, no armies kneeling in devotion. There was only silence, a silence he had created, and in that silence, he planted a seed. Zana. She had been a child of war, once called Rain, a survivor of the Battle of Ruusan, spared not by mercy, but by the dark side itself. Bane found her not by chance, but by instinct. The Force whispered of her potential, of her rage, of the fragile fire flickering beneath her calm. She had killed once already, and she had not wept for it. He took her, not to raise her, not to protect her, to shape her. The rule of two demanded balance, not kindness, not loyalty. Bane would teach her not to follow, but to watch him, to learn, and one day to destroy him. That was the path. That was how the Sith would become eternal. But the galaxy was not empty. The Jedi believed the Sith extinct, and in that belief, they turned their eyes inward. Their temples swelled again with students, their archives once more filled with songs of victory, but they had not seen the truth. They had only buried it. Bane and Zana did not strike quickly. That was not the new way. They moved like shadows, appearing only when needed. The new Sith would not fight to be seen. They would become myths, whispers, nightmares told in quiet tones. They would live in the blind spots of the Republic and grow without being noticed. Bane taught her rituals, many lost to time. He made her memorize pain, speak in the tongues of Sith sorcery. When she failed, he punished her, not with anger, with disappointment, because disappointment meant she had not yet earned the legacy he was crafting. She hated him. She needed him. It was perfect. But Bane's own body was beginning to betray him. The Orbalisk's creatures fused to his flesh from the tombs of Daxon had given him near invincibility. Their carapaces blocked blades, deflected blaster fire, and regenerated his wounds. But they were not loyal. They fed on his blood and his will. They poisoned him slowly, pushing their own instincts into his mind. He grew stronger, yes, but also more animal, more distant, less human. He began to search for ways to preserve his spirit, for holocrons that would carry his teachings, for vessels. There were rumors of ancient techniques of Sith who had passed their consciousness into others. He researched them all, his obsession tightening around him like a second skin. Zana noticed. She said nothing, because that was the test, the final one. Bane's rule demanded that the apprentice rise when the master weakened, and though she still feared him, still doubted, she had begun to wonder what he feared. And in that wondering, she began to plan. The Sith would not survive on obedience. They would survive on murder. Not of the Jedi, of each other. Bane had not created peace. He had created a war that could never stop. One master, one apprentice, every generation. An unbroken chain of death. The rule of two was not protection. It was a furnace. A way to ensure that only the strongest fire would survive, even if that fire destroyed its own maker. And that was how Darth Bane, scarred, poisoned, brilliant, became something no Sith had ever truly been. A legacy, burning in the dark, waiting to be challenged, waiting to be killed, waiting to be remembered. Chapter 9. The Phantom Years. The Valley of the Dark Lords had gone quiet. The screaming echoes of war, of betrayal, of mass extinction faded into dust. And somewhere deep within that silence, one presence remained, not in body, but in intention. Darth Bane had not built an army. He had built a seed, hidden, patient, merciless. Zana was that seed. She had watched her master kill the Sith, one by one, until none were left, and then she killed him. Not in rage, not in fear, but because the rule demanded it. Where Jedi sought wisdom, she sought secrecy. She wore no armor, bore no crown, built no temples. Her empire was silence. She passed through the galaxy like a shadow, training in forgotten places far from the eyes of the Jedi. She did not announce her existence. She made others forget it. And when her apprentice came, unknown to history, unnamed by records, he learned not how to destroy the Republic, but how to make it destroy itself. The Benite line was not forged in battle. It was forged in paranoia. Each apprentice knew their master was temporary. Each master knew their apprentice was their killer. But they did not hate each other. That would have been weakness. They respected the cycle. The rule of two was not a bond of trust. It was a chain of controlled hatred. Power passed not by permission, but by precision. If the apprentice could not kill the master, they were unworthy. If the master grew too powerful to be replaced, the Sith would die again. So the rule became something greater than a code. It became a ghost. One that drifted through centuries of Jedi peace, watching. And while Jedi younglings trained with wooden sabers under the sun, Sith apprentices bled for knowledge beneath poisoned moons. Each generation buried itself deeper. Darth Cognos, Darth Millennial, Darth Vectivus. Names whispered, debated, doubted. None of them ruled openly, none of them carved their names into stone. Because Bane had taught them, Sith who crave attention invite extinction. Instead, they took jobs in politics, business, science. Some served in governments they planned to overthrow. Some lived entire lives as common men, leaving behind only ruins of corrupted alliances and bent economies. The galaxy laughed at superstitions of Sith resurrection. They called it myth, a bedtime lie for fearful senators and overzealous Jedi archivists. But the Sith were already inside the walls, and by the time the Republic realized it, the knife would already be through its spine. Xana's influence lingered long after her death. Every Sith Lord who came after her measured themselves against her discipline. She was not known for wrath or cruelty. She was known for perfection. By her hand, the Sith became patient again. And as the Jedi lost themselves in peacekeeping and bureaucracy, the rule of two mutated. It no longer aimed to destroy the Jedi Order outright. That was the mistake of the past. This new lineage would do something worse. It would become the Galaxy Sept's secret master. And no one, no Jedi, no historian, no rebel, would even see it happen. Because for the next 1,000 years, the Sith did not conquer worlds. They conquered trust. Darth Cognos saw what Xana could not. That darkness alone was not enough. That in a galaxy of shifting power, the Sith could not survive without evolution. So she trained her apprentice not only in cruelty, but in vision. And then, she vanished. The rule of two continued, not as a line of tyrants, but of architects. Sith Lords, who rewired entire governments under false names, who manipulated planetary economies, corrupted minor officials, erased files, and rewrote truths. It was not power by war. It was power by erosion. Darth Millennial, heretic, prophet, outcast, broke the chain briefly. He believed in many Sith, not two. In his arrogance, he fled into the unknown regions, forming his own cult. But he was not the future, he was noise. The true line passed quietly through hands far colder. Darth Vectivus was next. A businessman, not a warlord. He lived on the planet Minos, surrounded by family and friends. He mined dark side anomalies and studied them, not for chaos, for understanding. His life seemed peaceful, but beneath his estate, in hidden chambers, his apprentices learned how to poison the minds of entire civilizations. And from that stillness came darker names. Darth Tenebrous, a Bith genius obsessed with manipulating midi-chlorians. He believed the Force was not a mystery to obey, but a code to rewrite. He took a new apprentice, one who listened, Darth Plagueis. He did not care for lightsaber combat. He cared for immortality. He viewed death as a flaw to be corrected, not a fate to be accepted. He studied the Force like it was a living virus, something he could bend through science, through meditation, through raw will. He built vast banking alliances across the galaxy, hid in the shell of a Mudan financier, and sat at the table of galactic politics without anyone knowing what he really was. He was not interested in glory. He wanted to make death obsolete. But even Plagueis, for all his brilliance, could not escape the rule. Because his apprentice was watching. That apprentice was born on Naboo, a child named Palpatine. And Palpatine did not ask to be chosen. He took it. When the time was right, when his master was drunk on his own success, the young Sith struck. There was no war between them. No dramatic duel, just a quiet moment, a quiet breath, and a life ended in sleep. It was the way of the Sith, one to embody power, one to crave it. But Palpatine was different. He did not just crave power, he believed he was power. He studied every master who came before him, not with respect, but with judgment. He saw their patience as weakness, their secrecy as fear. To him, the 1,000 years of shadows had done their job. Now, it was time for the Sith to return. But not as warriors, as saviors. Palpatine would not burn the Republic. He would become it. And the Jedi would not be killed in battle. They would be erased by trust. By the time anyone questioned the Chancellor from Naboo, the dark side had already won. Because for centuries, the Jedi had hunted Sith with red blades and black robes in mind. But the real Sith had become something worse. They had become invisible. There was no lightning in the sky, no fleet in orbit, no red lightsabers drawn in defiance. When the Sith returned to power, the galaxy applauded. It began with whispers, shifts in trade routes, security bills passed with no opposition, Jedi advisory roles quietly removed from senatorial councils, peacekeepers pushed toward irrelevance. Palpatine was not seen as a threat. He was seen as calm, intelligent, necessary. And that was his masterpiece. The Sith no longer attacked power. They became the gravity behind it. He used fear like a composer used silence, letting it hang, letting it shape the notes around it. Each crisis he allowed was followed by a solution only he could offer. The Republic screamed for order, and he gave it willingly. But in truth, he was not solving anything. He was feeding it. Behind every civil dispute, there was a whisper. Behind every economic collapse, a hand. Every rebellion that broke out, every planetary insurrection, every separatist whisper was part of his design. He did not need to destroy planets. He needed the Republic to beg for its own chains. The Jedi were not hunted with blades. They were isolated with policies. Moved from battles to bureaucracy, spread thin, pulled into conflicts they could not understand, could not win, could not question. Their wisdom was reduced to procedure. Their power became paperwork. The Order did not fall from weakness. It was made irrelevant by precision. And all the while, Darth Sidious sat beneath the surface, watching. He had no need for brute force. He had learned what the ancient Sith never could. Power was not about fear. It was about inevitability. He trained an apprentice, just as the rule demanded. But Dooku was never meant to rule. He was meant to lure, to confuse, to burn bridges that would never be rebuilt. Palpatine did not just want control. He wanted gratitude. So he split the galaxy in half, and he controlled both sides. The Clone Wars were not a tragedy to him. They were a symphony. Each note placed carefully, each death serving a purpose. Jedi turned generals, soldiers cloned for obedience, a war with no true enemy, only puppets. And when it ended, no one asked why. Because the Republic had already forgotten what peace looked like. The Senate welcomed an empire. The citizens cheered for security. And the Jedi were now criminals. Just like that, the Sith were not myth anymore. They were emperor. But it did not begin with war. It began with forgetting. The galaxy had been taught for 1,000 years that the Sith were gone, that evil wore a cloak, spoke in riddles, attacked with fire. But the real Sith had learned to smile. They wore democracy like armor. They let others destroy each other. And when the smoke cleared, they were already standing in the center with open hands. This was no longer the rule of two. It had evolved. The apprentice no longer rose to challenge the master, because the master had become the galaxy itself. The Sith no longer needed the shadows, because the galaxy had become one. But even then, Palpatine was not finished. He had ended the Jedi Order. He had turned the Senate into a shell, He had transformed the Republic into an empire, but there was one last truth he could not erase. The Force still moved, and there were echoes in it he could not silence. He knew the Sith's greatest enemy would never be a rebellion of weapons. It would be an awakening. So he began his final work. He searched for ways to cheat death, not through science, but through domination, not for life's sake, but so that no one else could have power after him. He no longer trusted the rule of two. He would not be replaced. He would not be betrayed. He would become the Sith Eternal. And yet, across the stars, others still remembered. The last traces of the rule, the ancient rituals, the hidden worlds, the bleeding Kyber crystals, all still lingered beneath the new empire. Whispers of Darth Bane's promise, remnants of Darth Plagueis's knowledge, hidden vaults, forgotten tombs, and voices trapped in artifacts. Even as he stood atop the galaxy, Palpatine feared those ghosts. He knew what they meant, that the dark side was never his alone, and that one day it would choose again. He took apprentices, Maul, Tyrannus, Vader, but they were not heirs, they were weapons, disposable, tools to be discarded when dull. Because he did not want a successor. He wanted to be the last. But in doing so, he broke the rule. He shattered the very truth that had kept the Sith alive for 1,000 years. And the Force, balance had been postponed, not prevented. And deep within the galaxy, far beyond the Empire's sensors, far beyond the maps of fleets and planets and dominions, something stirred. Hope. Not in battles, not in blood, but in memory. In the memory of what the Sith had done. In the quiet realization that power could not be forever. The phantom years had shaped a galaxy, but they had also sown the seeds of its awakening. Because the longer a lie is spoken, the more its silence feels like truth. And the longer darkness rules, the closer the dawn must come. Palpatine believed he had outgrown the ancient line, that the Sith had reached their final form. But he had only delayed the storm. And in the years to come, the ghosts he feared would rise again, through rebels, through forgotten children, through broken masks and burning thrones. The rule of two had served its purpose. It had brought the Sith from ruin to reign. But in doing so, it had also marked their end. Because when all power rests in one hand, that hand must never fall. Chapter 10. The Last Sith Empire. There was no thunder when the Chosen One fell, only silence. The galaxy did not feel it when Anakin Skywalker crossed the invisible line, when he went from doubt to darkness, from a Jedi to something colder. It happened without a scream, without a witness. Not even the Force cried out. But the wound remained. Anakin was not born for war. He was born in it, raised in the glare of prophecy, whispered about before he understood words, watched by men who feared what he might become, trained by a master who loved him like a brother, but never knew how to speak as a father. And when he looked to the Jedi Council for answers, he saw only closed doors and half-truths. They told him he was the Chosen One, but they never told him what that meant. They feared his attachments, but never asked why he held on so tightly. They sensed the storm inside him, but believed it could be trained away. When Anakin burned with questions about the code, about death, about the nature of the Force, they offered meditations instead of meaning. And slowly, the boy who had once raced pods across Tatooine began to drift. His victories became violent. His visions became warnings. His heart, once open, grew cold in places no one could see. The Clone Wars did not corrupt him. They only revealed what was already broken. He was made to be a weapon, and the Republic used him as one. They sent him from planet to planet, victory to victory, always with blood on his hands. He killed for peace. He obeyed without question, but with every battle something inside him chipped away. And when the war reached its end, and the Republic neared collapse, he was no longer fighting droids or separatists. He was fighting his own future. The dreams had returned, visions of Padme dying in childbirth, of helplessness, of loss. They felt like echoes from another life, but they were real, and when no Jedi could help him, not Obi-Wan, not Yoda, not the Council, it was a soft voice in the shadows that answered. Chancellor Palpatine. He had been there from the beginning, smiling, guiding, whispering. He offered no sermons, no rules, no judgment, only truth as Anakin wished to hear it. He spoke of power, not peace, of strength, not serenity. And when he revealed his true name, Darth Sidious, it was not a threat, it was a promise. A way to save the one he loved. To the Jedi, it was heresy. To Anakin, it was hope. And so the fall did not come in fire, it came in choice. He walked into the council chambers, lightsaber drawn, and did not hesitate. The children looked up at him. They trusted him. They knew his name. And still, he chose. When Mustafar burned beneath his feet, and Padme wept through trembling words, it was already too late. He had sworn loyalty to Darth Sidious. He had marched on the Jedi Temple. He had become something the Jedi never believed possible, a Sith reborn not from ambition but from love. But love twisted is no longer love. And Anakin Skywalker was gone. What remained was not fully man, not fully Sith, a creature bound in armor, shaped by rage, haunted by memory, a voice that cracked like old stone, a breath that echoed in silence. He did not die. He disappeared inside the armor. The prophecy was not broken. It was misunderstood because Anakin did bring balance, but not in the way the Jedi hoped. He destroyed both orders. He ended the Jedi. And he would in time end the Sith. But for now, he was called something else, something feared, Darth Vader. The rise of the Empire did not feel like thunder. It felt like order. Galaxies do not mourn when they are chained, not right away. First comes the calm, the silence that follows the purge, the illusion that things are stable again, that the wars are over, that peace has returned. But peace imposed by fear is not peace. It is only the absence of resistance. When the Jedi Temple was reduced to ash, when the Republic was renamed and the Chancellor crowned Emperor, no one stood against it. The senators cheered, the armies obeyed. The people, tired from years of war, welcomed the darkness as if it were shelter. And at the center of this illusion stood two shadows. Darth Sidious wore the face of Palpatine, but it was no longer a disguise. It was a crown. He was no longer hiding in secret. He ruled with pride, with cruelty sharpened by patience. He did not rush to destroy the galaxy. He allowed it to bend, slowly, quietly, one law at a time. And beside him stood Darth Vader. The armor was not just for survival. It was a symbol, a warning, a mask that erased the past to the galaxy. Vader was faceless, merciless, a weapon carved from suffering. He hunted Jedi remnants across forgotten worlds. He strangled governors who questioned orders. He did not shout. He did not plead. He enforced the will of the Sith with silence and slaughter. But the crown of the Empire was heavier than it seemed. For Sidious, the rule of two was never a bond. It was a leash. He had crafted Vader not as a partner, but as a tool. A being so broken, so consumed by loss, that he would never rise against him. Yet the Sith Lords who came before had all made the same mistake. They believed they could control hunger. They believed they could tame legacy. Vader was not the same man who wept at Mustafar, but the pain never left him. It followed him in dreams, in echoes, in the moments between battlefields when the helmet was still, and the Force whispered memories he could not silence. He remembered her voice. He remembered Obi-Wan's scream. He remembered who he had been. And Sidious knew. So he kept Vader busy. Missions, construction, the Death Star. He flooded the Empire with commands, as if the galaxy could be built into a cage strong enough to contain regret. But the dark side does not forget. It lingers in tombs, in artifacts, in ancient teachings long buried beneath the sands of Korriban and the ruins of Malachor. Sidious studied all of them. He sought immortality not through spirit but through science, and he watched his apprentice not with trust but with suspicion. Because the rule of two demanded betrayal, and Sidious was not ready to be replaced. He trained no heir. He hoarded knowledge. He twisted the dark side into something colder than it had ever been. The Sith were no longer a brotherhood, no longer an empire. They were a crown worn by one man, and Vader, for all his power, was not invited to take it. But the galaxy began to whisper again. There were rumors of a rebellion forming in secret, of a senator who defied the throne, of a boy born on Tatooine. And far from Coruscant, in the deep void between stars, the Force began to stir. Sidious believed he had won. He had broken the Jedi, broken the Senate, broken Anakin Skywalker. But the deeper truth is this: you cannot destroy something the Force still remembers. And Anakin, buried beneath the armor, still remembered. Not as a Jedi, not as a warrior, but as a father. There are some things the dark side cannot erase. It can silence memories, it can bury names, it can twist love into rage and turn hope into control. But it cannot destroy blood. It cannot sever the invisible thread that binds a father to his child. Not even when the father wears a mask. Luke Skywalker grew up without knowing his name, without knowing that his father was still alive. The stories told to him were soft and distant of a Jedi who had died during the Clone Wars, a man of honor, a hero. But heroes are not always dead. Sometimes they are only hidden. When Obi-Wan finally told him the truth, it was not a weapon, it was a scar. Anakin Skywalker had not died. He had become Darth Vader. And Luke, carrying the light of a forgotten order, was not only a rebel, he was a son. The Force does not speak in words, it speaks in feelings, in tremors, in instincts. And when Luke stepped onto Cloud City, when the doors closed behind him and the air turned cold, he felt it, not fear, not hatred, familiarity. Vader was not surprised by Luke Sep's arrival. He had known for some time. He had felt the boy in the Force like a shadow walking toward a broken mirror, and part of him had hoped that it might change something, that this boy, this son, might understand him, might follow him. But Anakin Skywalker no longer existed. Not in his voice, not in his face, only in silence. The duel between them was not just a test of power, it was a conversation. Every strike, every clash carried questions that neither of them said aloud. Why did you leave me? Why did you fall? Why did you come? And when the hand was severed, when the truth was spoken, I am your father, it was not a threat, it was not a lie. It was the one moment when the mask cracked, not from damage, but from honesty. Luke fell. But he did not fall to the dark. He chose the void over control, pain over power, and in that choice, something began to shift. Not in the galaxy, but inside the mask. Vader returned to his master with silence. He did not speak of the duel. He did not speak of the boy's scream, but the memory lived behind the lenses. Sidious felt it, a tremor, a risk. So he prepared a trap. He allowed the rebellion to believe they had a chance. He allowed the boy to come, and in the cold throne room of the second Death Star, the final act began. Sidious tempted Luke, not with power, but with fear. Fear for his friends, for his sister, for the ones he loved. The same fear that had once broken Anakin. But Luke resisted. He fought only when provoked. He struck only to protect. And even when he beat Vader to the ground, lightsaber raised in fury, he stopped. He looked at his father, at the wires, at the stump where his hand had been. He saw himself, and he said no. He would not kill him. He would not fall. The Emperor laughed, because he believed in victory only through hate. He unleashed lightning not at Vader, but at the boy. And something inside the mask screamed. There was no logic in what happened next. No strategy, no plan, only instinct. The monster stood, the machine moved. The broken warrior who had once been Anakin Skywalker lifted the Emperor in silence and cast him into the abyss. And in that moment, the prophecy was fulfilled. Not by power, but by love. The chosen one returned, and the Empire ended. The Empire fell with silence. No explosion could echo louder than the death of its master. And though the Death Star crumbled and the sky above Endor lit with fire, the true end had already happened on the floor of a throne room in the arms of a dying father. Luke Skywalker carried the body alone, not the armor, the man inside it. And for the first time in decades, Anakin Skywalker saw through his own eyes. The lenses were gone, the breathing was gone, the weight was gone. He asked only one thing of his son, to tell his daughter that there was good in him. Then he faded, not into pain, into peace. The galaxy would remember the rebellion, the celebrations, the fall of Palpatine. But what mattered most happened in quiet. In the fire where Vader Sith's armor burned, in the blue glow that stood beside Luke as he watched the flames, Anakin Skywalker returned to the Force, but the shadow he left behind did not vanish. Because the dark side never leaves clean. The Inquisitors were still out there, remnants of a dying faith. Imperial officers fled to the unknown regions, not with power, but with anger. And in the shadows, old secrets remained. Holocrons that whispered. Apprentices who escaped. Names that had not yet been spoken. Because the Sith never planned to rule forever, they planned to return forever. The rule of two had not been a command, it had been a cycle. A whisper passed from one hand to another, always evolving, always adapting. And even when it seemed broken, it only changed its face. Decades would pass, and in the ashes of Empire, a new war would rise. Kylo Ren would wear a mask. But not because he needed one, because he wanted one. Because the idea of Darth Vader, of what he represented, had not died. It had fermented, twisted, been reborn through pain and manipulation. Not through the Sith, but through their echo. And somewhere, out in the unknown, something waited. Older than Vader, older than Bane. A presence that had never been fully named, that fed on legacy, on fear, on the will to control. The Sith were gone, but the dark side was not. It cannot be killed, only forgotten, or remembered. And when it is remembered, it does not knock. It enters through doubt, through the need for order, through the scars we try to hide. Because the truth is, darkness does not die with a body. It lives in the silence that follows. Anakin Skywalker died as a man. Darth Vader died as a shadow. But both left something behind. And in every corner of the galaxy where pain still speaks, where fear still whispers, the last Sith Empire breathes. Not in war, in waiting.